I want you to watch this incredible debate about Israel and Gaza and why Israel are the good guys, Hamas are the bad guys. I think that the pro-Israel side here just destroyed. Check it out.
Well, I think we should start. A talking point you will hear on the left usually is the war didn't start on October 7th, and that's true. So we should look at the 5, 6 previous skirmishes or wars or rocket wars, whatever you want to call them, and ask the question, why didn't Israel finish off Hamas? They haven't changed. And the reason is because they understood that Hamas fights in such a despicable way as to maximize the civilian casualties on their own side. We all know, we've heard this before, that they will launch rockets from schools and mosques and so forth. But there was always, it was known to the Israelis, in fact it was known to human rights organizations, it was known to news agencies for many years that the headquarters of Hamas's Qassam brigades, their military wing, was under the largest hospital in Gaza. Who does such a thing? Unless there is a deliberate strategy to both maximize civilian casualties on your adversary side as well as the people you purport to govern. Now, the atrocities committed on October 7th were just so inhumane and so barbaric and savage that it left Israel no choice but to confront this dilemma that it had been dealing with for the past 17 years. It has to destroy this organization, despite the fact that it has spent nearly 2 decades building up an infrastructure, I might add, with aid provided that was supposed to go to the people of Gaza, to build an entire underground city just for its fighters and commanders so that they can be safe as Israel retaliates for the atrocities committed by Hamas. So when you're dealing with such a stark choice, yes, there are going to be civilian casualties because the army, the military that is usually supposed to protect those civilian casualties, would rather sacrifice them for a PR victory. And that kind of cynical thing. So back to your question, is it a just war? It absolutely is a just war, but it's more than just a just war. It's a necessary war. Because what Israel must do in eliminating Hamas is to show to every other dirtbag Islamist terrorist group and nation state like Iran that this tactic of fighting wars will not prevail. Because if Hamas survives, then you will better believe that the next wars that are fought by various kinds of fanatical terrorist groups will continue to learn from their tactics. So in my view, it's an easy question. Of course it's a just war. It's a necessary war, and when Israel finishes, hopefully, Baruch Hashem, and Hamas is no more, they ought to win a Nobel Peace Prize.
So, before we open it up, I think there's probably a lot of people here who would agree with you that if you could press a button and Hamas was no longer there,
yeah,
that would be desirable. The question is, can you eliminate Hamas by a war in which lots and lots of innocent people are being killed and maimed, or are you going to create more terrorists?
Well, listen, there will probably always be people who will be seduced by this lunatic death cult ideology. That's for sure. But there's a huge difference between having people believing all kinds of bad ideas and then having those ideas married up with a leadership, a military, a financial arm governing a statelet, as it were. So there are still, sadly, Nazis and neo-Nazis today, but the Third Reich does not exist. So in answer to your question, you're never maybe going to eliminate these terrible, toxic ideas, sure. But if you can show that these ideas will not be able to govern a place like Gaza or anywhere in the world, and that their leaders, wherever they are not going to be safe, I think that's a very important deterrent, and it makes it a much less of a threat. I think the most prudent thing to say is that, especially in the fog of war, we don't actually know who was a civilian and who was a fighter, and we usually find out that these things are wildly different, just like we hear initial reports of massacres that turn out not to be massacres, or we hear initial reports of things that look fine and turn out to be much worse. There's a lot of things that in the heat of a battle, in the heat of a war, we can't possibly know. But I'm comfortable saying that it's telling that some 10,000 or 11,000 people they can't identify doesn't mean, I think that would be reason for some sort of skepticism at that point, considering that is their job. More importantly, I would trust people like John Spencer, who is the expert on urban warfare from West Point, who went and embedded with the IDF and did his own survey, and he says that Israel's standard at this point, or the ratio for how many civilians to fighters that are being killed, is far better than U.S. Performance in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, in order to say that, you have to know what the number is, right? To be able to make that claim, you have to know what the number is. So what approximate number is it?
I would say approximately,
you can't
the
say
IDF says around 13,000 fighters are gone. Hamas, I think, has a lower number. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. And then
they say 6,000.
And then we have this number between 21,000 and 35,000 of civilians, and it's probably somewhere in the middle.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah,
the number specifically.
Well, I don't have one.
You don't have one?
I have the same information as Brianna said that everybody here has, but I'll tell you one thing that is relevant. There was a attack on a hospital, very early days in October. Everybody remembers this. And we found out later through multiple investigations, multiple journalistic outfits, discovering that it was an errant Islamic Jihad rocket. The initial number that was given of civilian dead by the Gaza Ministry of Health was 500 who died in a hospital. 500. Go look this up. And then it was revised down after it was revealed that it was their own
Yes, it was
rocket.
revised down.
I am talking, and you're not going to talk right now. So I'm not Robbie Suave, sorry. So those numbers, and I'll tell you this, like...
I must note, she is so insufferable. This woman, Brianna Joy Gray, she got fired for being pro-Hamas. She is unbelievably insufferable to listen to. So, what do you mean? Hamas are good.
In war, keeping in mind that Dresden, for instance, where I keep seeing this coming up on Twitter, etc., the German government determined that the number in Dresden was anywhere from 20 to 30,000 about 15 years ago. I mean, knowing this stuff in real time is very hard, so it's nearly impossible to answer that question without having some kind of knowledge. What I can tell you is I don't trust anybody in this. When I was in Ukraine, right after the war started in Ukraine, I was in a bar, and they had a thing up, the number of jets shot down, number of Russians killed, and it was wildly inflated.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was on the side of the Ukrainians. I didn't want to see them be invaded by these heathen Russians, but I was like, I think they're kind of inflating that. So everyone is doing that. So clinging to these numbers as if the Gaza Ministry of Health, of all people, don't have a vested interest in puffing them up as big as they can is ludicrous.
Okay, so one thing I observe is that actually we're not that far off.
Yeah, that's what's incredible. Everyone basically agreed with the numbers.
Yes.
The numbers conversation it's not actually a good question.
Well, you started it by saying the ratio.
No, well, the ratio.
That was your point.
The ratio is important. The total numbers are not important because.
But that's why I'm trying to work out is what ratio of fighters to civilians. Because you're saying there's too many civilian
Okay,
casualties.
yes, okay, I understand. The ratio is important.
Yeah.
But at the end of this conflict, all of the groups are going to come to approximately equal numbers. This has happened in all of the previous conflicts. Israel's estimates, Gaza's estimates, and the United States' estimates, they're all in about the same place. So like, you know, talking about, they're trying to exaggerate the numbers, so they said 500 or whatever. Yeah, they were wrong when they said that. They revised down, and I'm not even necessarily.
Were they wrong?
I'm not
or
even
lying?
necessarily.
Just an innocent mistake.
Or maybe it was
Within
manipulative.
24
Just a
hours, that
whoopsie.
was correct.
That's one at a time. One at a time.
No, but my point is
It's a
that
big ratio to get from 500 to 30.
No, it's fine. I agree that Hamas has an incentive to incentivize the number of civilians, and Israel has an incentive to incentivize to maximize the number of combatants. But I'm just saying, after the end of all of these conflicts, they get to the same numbers. They're all around the same place. So this isn't really going to be.
Okay, but we agree, right?
But here's an important point. Part of why the Hamas health ministry is very good at tracking the deaths is because, and by the way, Israel isn't contesting, apart from for political reasons, took a while for them to start contesting these numbers. It's because Israel knows where every single person in Gaza lives. Gaza is under the control of Israel. It is an occupied territory according to international law. And as a consequence, they know the names and ages and addresses of all the people that have been killed. That is why Palestinians have been able to put up slideshows where you can scroll through. It takes about, I think, 7 minutes to scroll through the names of just the 13,000 children that have been killed with their ages next to their names. These are real people. And so even if you think every adult, including all of the women, were Hamas and deserve to die, I think there's a really important question as to whether or not you think the 13,000 children who have been killed, some of whom we've watched been tracked down and killed by Israeli drone cameras, are the adequate consequences, collateral damage for this allegedly just war.
Okay.
So Brianna, if the reason that you trust those numbers is because they have the specific information, well, doesn't that also mean that you wouldn't trust numbers that were then, they couldn't say anything, information about this 10 or 11,000?
What are you talking about? I don't understand.
When they revised their numbers, they said, these are people that are part of the totals and we don't have names or anything else with that.
Corroborating evidence is what I'm describing. So for a lot of the deaths, they're able to...
You don't have any corroborating evidence for
none
a
of
third
this
of your
information.
One at a
Can
time.
you respond to the 13,000 children and whether or not you think that they're
I'm happy to
appropriate
respond to the 13,000
collateral
children.
damage?
Can you respond to whether or not you still think...
haven't done so yet.
What?
Can you respond? You said
Okay,
you're
well,
happy
you
to
haven't
respond, but
answered
you
my
haven't.
question. You just told me
I asked the
that
question
the
first,
reason that
Eli.
you trust the numbers is because they've painstakingly
That's not
given
what I said.
the names and the ages.
No.
Yes, you did. We
I
all
said
heard it.
one of the
One at a time.
And then I asked you
Okay.
if that's
All right.
the case.
All right.
They
why
all
don't
end
you-
up the same
Stop.
at the
Everybody
end in
stop.
every other
Everybody
one.
stop. Everybody stop.
Wait a minute.
Everybody stop.
The numbers debate is so stupid. How many you kill has zero to do with whether something is just or not. Simply, if Hamas, for example, kills less Israelis than Israel kills Palestinians, are they just? Are they just because of that? Are they more just than Israel simply because they killed less people? No, it's not how proportionality works. It's not how warfare works. Sorry. How it works is Israel is trying to target Hamas as well as get back their hostages. On the flip side, Hamas went and killed Israelis, went after innocent Israelis only. And so therefore, obviously, Hamas is the bad player here and Israel is the good guy. And to argue that all war, meaning Israel trying to go after Hamas and then they're killing civilians, is that an acceptable price to pay? That's a whole different argument to make, which you can say that all wars are evil. But in terms of this specific war, if you're going to say anything is a just war, this one certainly is. And like he said, probably also necessary.
I said
Everybody
one.
stop.
I said
Rihanna.
one of the reasons, one of the many reasons that you can come to trust the numbers is because there are these records that can corroborate many of the deaths. Moreover, I would point to other instances. For example, the fact that a CNN investigation showed that Israel has desecrated 16 cemeteries in Gaza since this conflict started.
Okay.
Is
We're
Hamas
getting-
under the cemetery? At what point do we acknowledge that this is an effort to destroy a community so that no one ever wants to return and ethnically cleanse them out of Gaza permanently?
Okay, cool. So we'll leave that part there because one of the interesting things is actually everybody agrees on the numbers, broadly speaking, and yet we're having this debate about it from a perspective of everybody actually agreeing on the numbers. So you brought up the ratio, right, which is why I've been honing in on the numbers point.
Yeah.
So the ratio is about 1 to 5, broadly speaking, right?
It depends, which is what I was talking about earlier with the AI program, but I'll let him answer.
Yeah, so that's where we are. Now, on that basis, why, and I'm going to ask them an equally annoying question for their side, but what should Israel have done in response? And please, we've had this discussion so many times on my show. When you ask somebody, what should Israel have done? And they say, not this. And they won't ever say what Israel should have done.
I'm
okay?
happy to answer that.
I will.
Yeah.
What should Israel have done in response to October 7th?
So targeted, very, very targeted strikes against actual Hamas targets that do not let this much civilian casualties. Somebody in the audience is laughing, so let me point out a little piece of detail about that. So Israeli intelligence sources have leaked that 2,000-pound bombs, these are dumb bombs that are not precision, they're cheaper munitions. They're not being used to uncover tunnels, as the PR agents have said, but to kill individual junior-level militants in their apartment buildings, okay? And thus, in lines with the rule of engagement, where they can kill 20 civilians to kill a single suspected junior militant, to kill all the civilians who live there. Nearly half of Israeli munitions dropped on Gaza are imprecise dumb bombs. So this is terrible. Okay, so you can, I hate Hamas, I want to get rid of Hamas. The second thing you need to do is actually resurrect the peace process, because what we've seen at every point in history is that if when the Palestinians feel that there is a real path towards peace, they moderate, the hatred decreases, and the violence stops. This is how the second Intifada ended. So the second Intifada ended with a resurrection of the peace process, okay? And since the end of the second Intifada, Fatah has not engaged in, violent terrorism, okay? So there's that. And then there was also the Oslo Accords in the 90s, which ended when the peace process didn't feel like it was working towards anything that was going to be successful, because Clinton required to Arafat that he waive the right of return, not limit the right of return. I'm talking about Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed from their home, expelled, okay? Benny Morris counts 24 massacres that happened in Palestine. And these include areas where at least 150,000 were pure expulsion in the Nakba, okay, of a total of 750,000. And then many, many others who fled in fear and all sorts of other things. But a large portion was actively expelled. And there are Palestinian refugees that are still actually alive from back then that can point to you exactly where their home was. They can point to you exactly where their home was, or their children are alive, or their grandchildren are alive, and they can point exactly to where their family's home was. Homes that often those families lived on for generations, okay? And that land was expropriated after the war and given to Jewish owners. Golda Meir lived in a house that was stolen from a Palestinian Christian and given to her, okay?
So just come back with me to what Israel should have done. Yep.
Targeted strikes that don't hit civilians and resurrecting the peace process.
Okay, Brianna, what should Israel have done?
I think you're right. I think Jake's right that it's really important to answer the question of what Palestinians want, to answer the question of what Israel should do in the wake of October 7. And I think pointing to the fact that, half the population of Gaza today are the actual people, or the descendants of the 700,000 who were purged, ethnically cleansed from the land that is now called Israel and the Nakba. So I'm sure many of you can imagine what you would do in that sort of a scenario. If when your grandparents were young and your parents were their children in their house, they had been chased out of wherever you live, 13 Pine Drive or whatever, and you were forced to move a state over in a refugee camp. That's constructively what Gaza is. It's a refugee population of 2.3 million people. And you can look over there. You are close enough, you can...
The real question is, why did that happen? They left out the part as to why the Nakba occurred, if it did occur. A lot of people are saying that it was just the Arab leaders that told them to leave. Although most people do agree that there was some sort of, okay, now that you lost the war, leave. But again, the Arabs started a war, then they lost, then they get expelled, which happens a lot, in warfare, and then they cried. And again, there are tons of Arabs that stayed. It wasn't like a forced expulsion as they're trying to put it. I'm sure some Israelis were very hostile towards Arabs. That all makes sense. But you started a war, a genocidal war against the Jewish people. You're lucky we didn't take you guys all out. This crazy idea of we'll start a war, then we'll hide behind our civilians, then we'll cry, and, it's your fault. No, you started a war, you effed around, now you have to find out. You have to pay for the consequences of your own actions.
Google Maps, if you have Google.
And I'm going to put this to them. I'm going to put this question to them, but what should Israel have done?
That there's a family that's literally living in a house that you might still have keys to, tending olive groves that were your family's line of business if they haven't cut those all down. And so the people who have had that experience, as you can imagine if you were in their shoes, are never going to let up, wanting to have the right to return to their homes. This is not
What is she on? Is she going to answer the question?
Not a kind of 2,000 years ago
Why?
sort of a dream. This is
Are there
in
lots
my
of Pakistanis
lifetime.
who want to return to India?
In my lifetime, you've purged me from my literal home where I have keys to, and now it's being occupied by someone who maybe immigrated from Europe, maybe immigrated from Brooklyn, and that injustice really hits home. On top of that, you've been denied the right to have any kind of state, a passport, an airport, a country, the kind of things that constitute a country, right? Joe Biden is now spending your tax dollars building a port in Israel, in Gaza rather, because Gaza isn't allowed to have those kinds of infrastructure, basic infrastructure projects on its own. So what absolutely needs to be done is for there to be a right of return for the people who were purged.
No, it is allowed. The problem is they've built down and not up. They haven't tried to build big projects. All they've tried to do is to, use rockets and build tunnels to attack Israel.
Out of Israel.
So, Brianna, just so I understand, you think that Israel's response to October 7th would have been to build Gaza an airport. Is that right?
Is that what you think I just said? You
I'm
have
just
some
trying to
serious
understand. I asked
listening
you the
comprehension issues, Eli, if you think that that's what I just said.
No, I'm trying to get it. You just gave a long,
I can slow it down for you and say it
eloquent
again if you're struggling to understand, Eli. Would you like me to say it for you again?
Anything, Brianna. Okay. I'm asking you. You were asked what Israel should have done, and you gave a long soliloquy about how Gaza doesn't have infrastructure.
As the moderator,
so I'm asking,
I do agree
is that
with
what
this,
you think
right?
Israel should have done in response
You
to
haven't
October
answered
7th?
my question, which is fine.
The right of return. Do you not know what the right of return is?
In response,
I know all about the right of return.
Hold on, let me do my job.
Yeah.
So, in response to October 7th, Israel should have instituted the right of return.
I mean, long before October 7th.
No, but after
there's
October
gonna
7th.
There's going to be no peace until Palestinians have been granted the right of return. Yes, that's right.
We're talking about this particular war, and we're asking if it's a just war.
Yeah, look, I think there's a world in which people kind of intrinsically understand a kind of Old Testament eye for an eye sensibility.
I'm going to put this all to them.
Sure.
I'm asking you,
I'm
after October 7th, what should Israel have done? It's a fair question.
I'm literally answering.
You have not answered my question.
Like I was saying, I think intrinsically there's an idea that there's an eye for an eye situation after October 7th immediately, where a certain number of people needed to be killed, Hamas needed to be targeted, there needed to be a reaction, right? I can understand that. But in the first week of the siege after October 7th, more bombs were dropped on Gaza, a 25-mile strip by 5 miles wide, than were dropped on Afghanistan in 1 year of war.
Okay,
So,
let me try a different way. Do you agree
no,
with
wait.
Jay?
And very quickly, the number of Palestinians that have been killed doubled, tripled, quadrupled the number that had been killed on October 7th. So the question is, much less than what's been done. Almost immediately, there was a retribution in a kind of Old Testament way. And everything beyond that, I see very little moral justification for.
Okay. Now, you guys, I hope you answer my questions.
Wow. Thanks for
we
having
got
us.
there, by the way. Thank you. I appreciate that. We did get there. I'm not being a dick about it. One of the biggest arguments about October 7th is that what do you expect oppressed people to do?
First of all, we did not get there. What was her answer? I try to write in the comments. I don't know what her answer was. Well, maybe it was that Israel should just give Palestinians the right of return. So after Hamas goes and kills a bunch of Israelis, which Hamas is a Palestinian organization, they should say, "Wow, we didn't realize that you were so upset in Gaza. Now let's give you some more land so you can kill more of us." Do you think we're stupid? Do you think we're actually that dumb and suicidally oriented?
If you're living in the situation that Brianna and Jake are describing, if your family's been moved from their homes, if they see daily violence, if all of this stuff is going on, what do you expect those people to do? Now, this isn't in any way to obviously justify October 7th, but isn't the behavior of Israel going to continue leading to these sorts of atrocities and this endless war that never ends?
Well, I mean, to answer your question, if you go back to 1936, the first time that the Yishuv, before there was a Jewish state, responded to the Peel Commission was to accept partition of the land. The response from the Arabs was known as the Arab riots, which were quite destructive. Move forward a little bit more to 1947, there's a UN partition plan. Guess what? David Ben-Gurion and the Yishuv, before there's a state of Israel, accepts it. The Arabs do not. 48, they declare independence, but only in the area that was allotted by the partition. But not only did the Palestinians declare war, but so did every other Arab state, for the most part, declare war in 1948. Moving on, 1967, all the Arabs again attack Israel. Israel wins. They get a lot of territory.
The Arabs did not attack Israel in 1967. Israel started that. Israel started the 1967 war.
Oh, it did?
That's a false statement.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of Gamal Abdel Nasser? Come on, man.
Well,
Listen,
I'm aware who Gamal Abdel Nasser is. I'm aware he was building up troops on the border. I'm also
aware that like every other day he was saying, I'm going to destroy Israel?
I'm also aware he didn't start it. Israel started it.
Okay.
And U.S. intelligence's assessment was that
two Arab armies are amassed on Israel's border, and their leaders are yelling and screaming about how they're going to destroy the Jews and run all the Jews into the sea.
Let the man finish.
And they invaded anyway.
He didn't interrupt you. Don't interrupt him. Why is this so fucking difficult? Sitting over here quiet as you guys speak. Let us talk.
Anyway,
Fucking hell.
after 1967, the first response from Israel was, all right, let's negotiate. And then they were greeted with what is known as the 3 no's. Now, fortunately, better leadership did come along. There was another war in 1973, we all know, and the Egyptians made peace, and then the Jordanians made peace, and other Arab states have largely gotten out of the maybe we can just destroy Israel business. The last stand here of the people who are still rejecting any possible partition are the Palestinians. And the Palestinians continue to start wars, which they hope will eliminate Israel, lose those wars, and then say, oh my, we're the victims. I want to go back to 1948. 1948, again, was not a war that the Jewish state started. It was a war that the Jewish state finished as part of its independence. Now, there were all kinds of population movements and transfers throughout the 1940s, as we all know. But the only group of people that has its own special UN organization to basically treat the great-grandchildren of original refugees as if they have this so-called right of return are the Palestinians. We don't hear anything about Kashmiris wanting to go to India or various ethnic Germans wanting to go back to their homes in Poland or any number of things. Millions of people in this period. The only people we care about is the Palestinians.
So what should they do? What should Palestinians do, in your opinion?
Stop starting wars with Israel and losing.
But what about I think it's a fair point that they're not living in the best conditions.
No, they're not living in the best conditions.
Right?
And by the way, there have been gazillions of dollars of international development aid to Gaza. But guess what? It's stolen by their horrific and terrible leaders. And it's not just Hamas, who are these fanatic dirtbags, which we all know what they did on October 7th. It's also the Palestinian Authority. They are so incredibly corrupt. They pocket it for themselves. And the only way that they are able to constantly kind of hold on to power is by poisoning the minds of their population and making them think that they can destroy a thriving Jewish state that's there when Israel has in Oslo, under Ehud Olmert, and I'm telling you, if there was a Palestinian leader that said, okay, let's do it, let's do the partition, I guarantee you the Israelis would be fine with it and we could get it done. But that's the problem. The problem is the Palestinians still want it all and they just have to let it go. It's a dangerous delusion.
In what way is that not a boss?
Did you want to say something before I go to Michael?
The irony is that that's almost the opposite of what's true. It's been widely reported.
Is it almost the opposite of what's true?
Let her say.
Wait a minute, Eli. There was a lot of screaming and hollering about interruption, so I just want to know what the standards are before I continue.
Guys, let me do the moderating and you do the debating, okay? So say your piece.
Bibi Netanyahu was caught delivering suitcases of cash to Hamas. He's so invested in funding Hamas and Hamas being in power in Gaza. And the reason is, Israel needs to be able to rely on the argument that the political power that Palestinians have is so radical, is so right-wing, is so hateful that there cannot be no negotiation. So he has worked to undermine the Palestinian Authority. He worked to undermine more moderate politicians that Palestinians have nominated over the years, have put forward over the years. And as early as this past week, as the International Criminal Court has looked into issuing warrants for Israelis who have committed war crimes, what has been his response? His response has been to threaten not Hamas or anything going on in Gaza, but to threaten to do more war crimes in the West Bank if he or any other members of his administration are charged with any of these ICC warrants. There has been a repeated effort to punish the most moderate Palestinians, because otherwise he would be forced to make a case for why he doesn't think that people who are literally from what is now described as Israel cannot return home. And the real reason why they cannot allow people to have the right to return is because there's a commitment to it being not just a pluralistic state like the one we live in, where we're very proud of having people from all over the world who found freedom from religious persecution, and you can live however you want to live and practice whatever religion you want to practice, that they specifically want it to be a Jewish ethno-state. And if you were to allow the approximately 5 million or so Palestinians that live in the West Bank and in Gaza to be a part of contiguous Israel, they would lose a religious majority and lose the ability to have, you could have a pluralistic, progressive state, but it would no longer be a Jewish ethno-state.
Okay.
Can I respond to that?
Very quickly,
I
because
follow
I want
the
to
news
go to
very
Mike.
closely.
Very
I don't
quickly.
remember Netanyahu's "we promised to do war crimes in the West Bank" speech, but okay.
What are you
we'd like
talking
to
about?
Google.
Who said
When did
anything
he
about his
say
speech?
that? You just said it, Brianna.
He gave a
You
speech.
just said he promised to do more war crimes in the West Bank. I'm just basically quoting you back to you. Anyway, more importantly, I wanted to say Netanyahu did not deliver suitcases full of cash. He arranged for the Qataris to give development aid to Hamas because no one in Europe, for good reason, no one in America for good reason, wanted to actually have the, dirty up their hands by giving various kinds of money to a humanitarian group. But given the fact that they were the sovereigns of Gaza, someone needed to provide for basic infrastructure.
I want to interrupt here. You don't even have to go ahead and say, oh, that he was just doing this or he was just doing that. Even if Netanyahu was totally wrong in giving aid to Hamas and allowing that, and even if it's all his fault, then you're still going to take the side of Hamas. You're angry at Netanyahu with even being a little bit involved with Hamas and giving them money, and then you're taking the side of Hamas. You're basically saying, oh, you're evil because you associated with them, and now I'm going to basically take the side of the people that you associated with, and that's why I called you evil to begin with. That is the level of stupidity that I'm hearing from the other side. Netanyahu is Hamas, but then why is he trying to destroy them now? And if he is Hamas, why are you supporting Hamas?
It's UNRWA.
That's what happened.
Hold on.
That's what happened. That's what happened, and it wasn't Netanyahu's policy. This is a myth that lots of people believe that Netanyahu did this for some cynical reason. He did it because the entire rest of the civilized world, like the United States, was saying you have to figure out some way to get some development aid into Gaza, even though I understand that no other groups really want to, except for Qatar, of course, wants to deal with Hamas. It wasn't because, oh, wow, we really like Hamas launching rockets at our country every 6 months. Come on.
So
this
I-
is
You
like,
can't
it's
have it
just
both ways,
One
Eli.
second. I want to let Michael.
You just finished
I'm gonna
saying.
answer a question.
Guys, I've given you both. I'll come back to you in a
the
second.
Michael, you wanna add
No,
anything?
I have it in front of
the
me.
mistake
I
was
read
my
it.
mother
I need
taught me
to
to be
ask
polite.
Michael a
and that was
question,
a
and I'll come back
big
to it.
mistake.
Please, it's two sentences.
Yeah.
Two sentences. I'm going to hold you
This
to
is
that.
the
Get the papers out.
Netanyahu. This is the Netanyahu quote. You can judge if. This is the
Let me do the
Netanyahu
moderating.
quote,
I'll
you can
take care of
judge
it.
if
Two
if
sentences.
He's accurate. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy, to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the
When
West
did he say
Bank.
that?
That's Netanyahu in 2019 in a meeting with the Likud leaders.
Okay.
2019.
Okay.
In the meeting with who? What leader?
Eli, let me park
Likud
this for a
leader.
second. Guys, let's park this. Michael, what should the Palestinians do?
What do the Palestinians
Yeah.
do? I didn't even know where we are now. We're talking to the Palestinians. But
That still doesn't explain, even if that's the case. Yeah, bolster Hamas, stop Palestinians. He's trying to destroy Hamas now, regardless of what he did in the past. Like, this whole argument seems like they're arguing Netanyahu's character. Like, Netanyahu doesn't necessarily represent Israel as a whole, and a lot of his policies do end up getting, passed and rejected. Passed on and rejected by the Supreme. There's a lot of bureaucracy in Israel. It's not like he's a dictator. That's A. B. Even if he in the past corroborated with Hamas, right now he's trying to destroy them. And so this idea that, like, you look up quotes from 2019 and say, oh, Netanyahu is evil, and what does that have to do with the war that Israel is waging right now?
they should do. I'm going to go back a little bit because I very mistakenly decided to wait for people to talk that I would talk. Big mistake. But a couple things. You have to point out the boring things that everyone you hear like by rote all the time. Is that there are 2 million Arabs that live in Israel. There are 0 Jews that live in Gaza, right? It's a relevant data point. And I suspect what Brianna is saying with right of return, and I think you said something that this place called Israel, or so-called Israel or something. I suspect, and this is the weird conversation that we're having when people talk about Zionism these days. Incredible to me that I'm like, I thought this was a settled matter. Zionism is about this creation of the state of Israel, which was created. Are you a Zionist or are you an anti-Zionist? What I'm trying to figure out is if my opponents here believe that the state of Israel should exist at all, and if we should wipe a UN member nation off the map, because that is effectively what right of return is. The right of return is not take 7 million refugees, and this number expands. These are people who have never been in the area, have resettled other places. And Benny Morris's book is far more nuanced than that is allowing. There were people who were expelled, there were people that were forced out by their own side, etc. Benny Morris has actually said this, you quoted him, so let me go to him, that if you do have right of return, which by the way, 7 million people doesn't mean 7 million people that go to the West Bank and Gaza. Very specifically doesn't mean that. It goes to what Israel is now. And what Morris said, and I think it was an article Tablet, he said, the response to this is if you think October 7th is bad, this is going to be a giant bloodletting. This is not as if 7 million Danes are coming in. These are people who have an ideological predisposition. Obviously Hamas now in West Bank is the most popular party. As Eli points out, Mahmoud Abbas and the PA have been as corrupt as you can be. You can see that with Suha Arafat's lifestyle in Paris. They've been stealing money for years. So that's their fault in some ways too. But the popularity of Hamas, and again, we have to be very simple about this, and cite this and cite that, but in its charter, which is just saying, hey, guys, this is explicitly what we believe. Which was said, by the way, the other day. There was a quote from one of these Hamas spokesmen, and they said, no, we don't believe that we will never have a two-state solution with the Israelis. Israel must go. That is a non-negotiable position, and if anyone thinks, as the people who were chanting out in front of Columbia were chanting, and they weren't students, but important distinction apparently, but burn Tel Aviv to the ground. It's not these are not nice people.
So what should the Palestinians do?
What the Palestinians do is, I have to be really boring again and repeat what Eli said, is don't launch wars that will result
But
in
how
what
do
we're
they
seeing.
address the fact that they're living in conditions in which they don't want to be living?
It's the same answer. It's the same answer. I mean, look.
No, that's a negative. Don't start a war is a negative answer. How do they get a better deal for them without starting more wars?
How about I say don't start future wars? That's one thing that you could do. But if you think about this, there was a Palestinian guy I saw interviewed, and he said, before the Second Intifada, I could take my donkey from the West Bank to the sea. And as a result of militancy and the absolute people shouting about intifadas, when you go back and see 1,000 Israelis were killed, 1,200 Israelis were killed during the Second Intifada. And what do you do now? I mean, look, it's a very, very difficult question. If I had that answer, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be in Tel Aviv cashing checks because I knew the answer to this. But the answer is, in the broadest possible way, is that you have a people that are corrupted by a corrupt ideology. What we will never talk about here, and I don't hear this talked about in any of the conversations about the conflict now, is Islamism, is a radical Islamic view of the world, which is dangerous. And it's dangerous if it's not that it's anybody who has that sort of radical view of the world. And that is being inculcated in children, in the schools. I mean, we have these arguments with Ron DeSantis and the kids, the books kids are reading here. Look at what is being taught to kids in Gaza. That is a very difficult question, Konstantin, and it's like a root and branch kind of thing. I don't see a solution.
I'm going to move on. We've got about...
What I've noticed with every single one of these debates is that it really just comes down to Golda Meir's famous quote: as soon as they start loving their children more than they hate ours, we will have peace. And until then, we're going to have more and more war because they keep on just launching wars. Like the guy said, they can't stop themselves. They're like addicted to just launching wars against the Jews. And then their strategy is cry and have the media propagandize things and make Israel stop and then launch another war a few years later. Hopefully this will be the last Gaza war because Israel is fed up. For more, subscribe to the channel. If you want to help us make more of these videos, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/JewishUncensored. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.